greetings, my Eid greetings, and good evening to you. I am immensely grateful and I deem it a privilege and honor to be presenting this Nazia Hassan Memorial Lecture in this historical setting on the life and works of Allama Muhammad Iqbal. The last occasion that I remember that a major event in the United Kingdom took place concerning Allama Iqbal was in 2008 in Cambridge, where he studied around that time, to celebrate his 100 years in Europe, because he finished his studies in 1908. And funnily enough, his life is full of such milestones that he gives us some excuse or the other to link some milestone with another major event over here today. While preparing for this talk, I've come across a little detail which is worthy of mention right at the outset, that this time, this year, 100 years ago, was the time of publication of Allama Iqbal's first collection of poetry, which was called Asrar-e-Khudi in Persian, which means secrets of the self. So, as we celebrate 100 years, as we commemorate Nazia Hassan and celebrate 100 years of Allama Iqbal's publication of Secrets of the Self or Asrar-e-Khudi, I will try and present to you in the allocated time a full view, an overview of his life, of his personality, of his works comprising his poetic art, comprising his philosophical thought, and comprising his political discourse. Allama Muhammad Iqbal was born on the 9th of November 1877 in the city of Sialkot, which is now in Pakistan's Punjab province. His father, Sheikh Nur Muhammad, was a tailor by profession and a pious individual with a mystic bent. His father had no formal education, but could read Urdu and Persian books and treasured the company of scholars and mystics, some of whom called him an unlettered philosopher. Allama Iqbal's mother, Imam Bibi, was illiterate, but was highly respected in the family as a wise and generous woman who quietly gave financial help to the poor and needy and arbitrated in neighbors' disputes. A few days before the birth of Iqbal, his father, Sheikh Nur Muhammad, had a dream. He says, "I saw a big crowd gathered in a large field. A magnificent colored bird was flying over our heads, and everyone was admiring it and trying to catch it. But none succeeded. And at last, it got tired and fell into my lap." He understood this to be a message from God, that he was about to bless him with a world-famous son. Hence, the unlettered philosopher gave his son the name Muhammad Iqbal. The word Iqbal, whose origins lie in the Arabic language, means recognition, stature, respect, and fortune. About 400 years before Iqbal's birth, his Brahmin ancestors, who lived in Kashmir, now in northern India, had converted to Islam. As the High Commissioner is present, I must say, Indian-occupied Kashmir. I stand corrected. So the Brahmin ancestors had converted to Islam. And by the way, in this presentation on poetry and literature and art, if you don't have to wait until the end of the talk, if you come across something which you like, which you want to applaud, I'll be very happy to accept it from you. So about 400 years before Iqbal's birth, his Brahmin ancestors who lived in Kashmir, in Indian-occupied Kashmir, had converted to Islam. In the late 18th or early 19th century, when Afghan rule in Kashmir was being replaced by Sikh rule, Iqbal's great-grandfather emigrated from Kashmir to Sialkot. Now, Allama Iqbal's life, which I begin with, is divided by most of his biographers in 4 phases. The first one is in the city of Sialkot from 1877 until 1895, when he attained the age of 18. As a 4-year-old child, Iqbal was sent to a mosque where he learned how to read the Quran. He fondly relates several anecdotes to show how his attitudes were subtly but decisively influenced by his early training. At the age of 5, he was fortunate enough to become the student of one Sayyid Mir Hassan, a distinguished scholar of religion and literature who headed a madrasa, a religious school in the city of Sialkot. He instructed Iqbal in the Islamic religious heritage and also helped him cultivate a highly refined literary taste. He spotted the talent of young Iqbal and persuaded Iqbal's father to have Iqbal admitted into Sialkot's Scotch Mission High School, where Mir Hassan himself was a professor of Arabic. Allama Iqbal passed his intermediate or FA from that same Scotch Mission School or college in 1895. While at Scotch Mission, he had started composing poetry at the age of 15 or 16 years. He also became a student by correspondence of Mirza Dagh of Delhi, who was a famous Urdu poet, who also earned the title of Nightingale of India. By the age of 18 years, Iqbal had acquired all that Sialkot had to offer him, and Dagh, his teacher by correspondence, had also advised him that Iqbal's poetic art needed no further correction. His early years and his parents' training gave him a deep religious and mystical orientation, which he was to retain for the rest of his life. His love for the Islamic scripture, the Quran, is well known. He himself claims that his poetry is no more than an elucidation of the Quranic message. His father once advised him to read the Quran as if it were being revealed to him direct from God, for only then, he said, would Iqbal truly understand it. This remark left an indelible impression on Iqbal's mind. In fact, in his one place in his poetry, he pleads to the Prophet Muhammad that on the day of judgment, you do not let me have the privilege of kissing your feet if my poetry has anything other than the Quran in it. The translation, which I present to you of these verses, is to the following effect. If indeed the mirror of my heart is without luster, and if indeed there is anything in my words other than the Quran, then, O Prophet, rend the fabric of my thoughts, sweep clean the world of my offending thorn, choke in my breast the breath of life, remove my wicked mischief from the community of your followers, do not nurture the life of my seed, do not provide me any portion from spring's bountiful showers, disgrace me on the day of reckoning, and do not allow me the honor of kissing your feet. Referring to his father's spiritual influence, he said he had not formed his view of life through philosophical investigation, but had inherited it. The influence of his first mentor, Sayyid Mir Hassan, was also formative. A committed and enlightened scholar, he instilled the love for the Islamic heritage and also introduced, this is important, he also introduced Iqbal to modern learning. And Iqbal was not one to forget this. In 1922, when he was being offered the knighthood by the British government, he made his acceptance conditional upon recognition of his first mentor's, Mir Hassan's, scholarship. When he was asked, what books has Sayyid Mir Hassan authored? Iqbal replied, I am the book he has authored. And when Iqbal was conferred the knighthood in 1923, his first mentor, Mir Hassan, received the title of Shamsul Ulama, which means the son of the scholars. We complete the first phase, and he is 18 years old and now moves to Lahore in 1895 for a period of 10 years until 1905, the second phase of his life. So he moved to Lahore in 1895 to study in the famous government college, where he spent 4 years. He earned his BA in 1897, taking English, philosophy, and Arabic, and his MA in philosophy in 1899. He was appointed the Macleod's Arabic reader at Lahore's Oriental College, where he taught history, philosophy, and economics, and worked on research and translation projects. He also served as assistant professor of English at Government College Lahore for a short while, his own alma mater. Once again, he was fortunate because the most important influence on him at that time was the able mentorship of Sir Thomas Arnold, who had taught at the Aligarh College until 1898 and had then moved to Government College in Lahore. He coached Iqbal in several ways and encouraged him to undertake various research projects. Allama Iqbal's biographer Mustansir Mir, whose work I gratefully acknowledge because today's presentation in significant part draws upon his work, writes that the precious stone discovered by Mir Hassan in Sialkot was polished into a glittered jewel by Sir Thomas Arnold in Lahore. Lahore boasted several literary societies where poets presented their work before the general public. And Iqbal quickly established his credentials as a fine poet. He started with conventional themes of Urdu poetry: love, suffering experienced on separation from the beloved, and desire to reunite with the beloved, employing the form of ghazal or love poem to that end. But he later chose and perfected the form of nazm or narrative verse as the principal form of his poetry. His originality burst through the rigid framework of convention, and his novel images gripped the audience's attention, winning him acclaim from noted poets and critics of that time. His poetry showed an increasing influence of English poetry, and his works became an embodiment of literature and political thought which was both European and Indian, as he started to deal with themes of patriotism. This is what Kavalji was also talking about when he wrote in 1904. This is from the same time, Sare Jahan se Achha Hindostan Hamara, Hum Bulbule Hain Iski, Ye Gulsita Hamara. But most importantly, Iqbal's poetry receives a new direction through his association with the Society for the Support of Islam, the Anjuman Himayat-e-Islam, which was established in 1884 to offer financial aid to students, widows and orphans, and to help poor people to stand on their own feet by giving them vocational training. The Society for the Support of Islam, the Anjuman Himayat-e-Islam, used to have annual fundraising events which were widely attended. The Society's annual meeting on the 24th of February 1900, a 23-year-old Iqbal was present, was noteworthy. He famously read his poem, The Orphan's Lament, in Urdu called Nala-e-Yatim. A budding young writer who was present in the audience documented that. He said, Iqbal stood up and took his place. He was a thin, fair-skinned and handsome, bespectacled man who had adorned a black achkan and a Turkish fez over his white shalwar kameez. The subject of his verse bore sadness. His language was simple, his voice loud and clear, and his powerful delivery created pin-drop silence when he drew his picture of the pitiful conditions of the orphans. All eyes were filled with tears. Thereafter, in his poem, when he presented the orphans before the Prophet Muhammad, the audience started howling and screaming in sorrow. And when finally the Prophet Muhammad appeals for the orphans' aid, every pocket in the audience was emptied in contributing to the cause. The audience was so moved. The audience was so moved that Iqbal was asked to reread his entire poem. And the Society's fundraising event, needless to say, that year was more than successful. This also won Iqbal tremendous acclaim, and he became instantly famous. In this time, Iqbal also wrote and published his first Urdu book. It was not a collection of poetry. It was a book on the principles of economics, Ilmul Iqtisad, in 1903. And under Arnold's tutelage, Iqbal the poet now became Iqbal the academic. He taught and wrote prolifically on a range of diverse subjects. Arnold motivated Iqbal to pursue higher studies in the West, and Iqbal had probably already begun the process of intellectually synthesizing the Eastern and Western traditions. He had already gained recognition as an accomplished poet and thinker in pre-independence India. And according to in the words of his biographer Mir, in the fertile soil of Lahore, the sapling of Sialkot had become a sturdy tree. The third phase of his life comes between 1905 and 1908. In 1905, Iqbal arrived in Cambridge, entering Trinity College as a research scholar. Cambridge was then a renowned center of Arabic and Persian studies. Its luminaries included Reynold M. Nicholson, who later translated Iqbal's Persian work Asrar-e-Khudi, same one which was first published in 1915, into English in 1920. And that publication, by the way, introduced Iqbal into the West as a major Muslim thinker as well, which was 1920. Iqbal met with the philosopher John McTaggart and attended his lectures on Western thought. He also enrolled as a student of law at Lincoln's Inn, London, and at Sir Thomas Arnold's suggestion, registered as a doctoral student at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich in Germany. In 1907, in June 1907, Iqbal earned an MA from Cambridge. In November 1907, note the years, in November 1907, Munich University awarded him a PhD for his thesis in the development of metaphysics in Persia. In July 1908, Iqbal was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn, London. Thus, in 3 intense years, Iqbal remarkably earned 3 degrees from 3 prestigious institutions: a master's degree from Trinity College, Cambridge, a doctorate from Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and a bar at law from Lincoln's Inn, London, which none of his famous contemporaries like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Mahatma Gandhi, or Pandit Nehru could accomplish in such short time. He also acquired a sound knowledge of German language. Already familiar in translation, now he was in a position to make a first-hand, in-depth study of the German philosophical and literary tradition. References to German writers and their thoughts thereafter became more frequent in his works, and he began to see himself playing in India a role similar to that played by Goethe in Germany, whom he greatly admired. Sir Thomas Arnold continued to play an important role in Iqbal's education and intellectual upbringing. During his visits to London, Allama Iqbal frequently stayed with Arnold, and he also substituted for Thomas Arnold as professor of Arabic at the University of London when he took leave for 6 months. While in Europe, Iqbal made close and critical study of Western civilization, on which he was to comment in much of his later work. While he admired certain aspects of that civilization, he was critical of its secular character and warned Muslims of blindly imitating the West. In his own words, from his first Urdu work, Bang-e-Dara, same poem, Tulu-e-Islam, the storm from the West has transformed Muslims into real Muslims. मुसलमा को मुसलमा कर दिया तूफान मगरिब ने, तला तुम हाय गौहर ही से है, तला तुम हाय दरिया ही से है गौहर की सैराबी. Arguably, this observation, the storm from the West has transformed Muslims into real Muslims, this observation applies first and foremost to Iqbal himself. He underwent a major change in his view and estimation of nationalism. He had previously championed the cause of Indian nationalism and had worked towards Hindu-Muslim unity. To him, loyalty to the country could coexist without any serious tension with one's commitment to one's religion. But when he witnessed at first hand the deep discord that jingoistic nationalism had caused among the major European powers, and that several years later was to climax in World War I, his dedication turned to the ideological universalism of Islam, and his transformation had far-reaching consequences for his poetry and thought. In a letter after he returned to India in March 1909, he notes, "I have always believed that this country, India, should rise above communal differences. And even now I am adhering to the same principle in my private life. But I do not believe at the same time that it would be best for Muslims and Hindus to keep, but I do believe at the same time that it would be best for the Muslims and Hindus to keep their separate national identities intact, and that the idea of a common Indian nation might look charming and romantic, but was totally impracticable in view of ground realities and the inadvertent tendencies of both communities." The last phase of his life, the last 30 years, 1908 to 1938, when he resided in Lahore, which earned him a title of Iqbal-e-Lahori, even though he was from Sialkot. He returned to India in July 1908 and set up legal practice in Lahore. He also taught philosophy at his alma mater, the government college. In 1911, the British government, under Hindu pressure, reversed the 1905 partition of the Bengal province, which caused grave disappointment to the Muslims. International scene also was depressing from the Muslim perspective. Italy had occupied Libya, France had annexed Morocco, and several Balkan states had attacked Turkey, stripping it of its East European possessions. The local and international events caused incredible despair and helplessness in many sensitive Muslims, including Iqbal, whose life from now onwards is marked by a growing earnestness of purpose. In both poetry and prose, Iqbal now begins to address the global plight of Muslims, and in this process, his philosophical and political ideas start to take more definite shape. From being an Indian nationalist who had written, "We are Indians and India is our country, which is the best in the whole world," he now wrote the Islamic community song proclaiming, "We are Muslims and the whole world is our country." His first book of poetry was published in 1915, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, in the name and style of the Persian work Asrar-e-Khudi, The Secrets of the Self, which addressed the worldwide Muslim community. Upon publication of the English translation of this work by Nicholson in 1920, Iqbal was introduced in the West as a major literary and philosophical writer. Reviewing the English version of Asrar-e-Khudi, Herbert Reed compared Iqbal to the famous American poet Walt Whitman. Several other Persian and Urdu collections of poetry were to follow. Becoming heavily engaged on the intellectual, educational and social fronts, Iqbal gave public talks and academic lectures, wrote articles for journals and newspapers, assisted in the production of textbooks for students at school and college levels, and corresponded with many people, expressing a wide range of views. His major philosophical work, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam, was published in 1934. He was also invited to give the Rhodes Lectures in 1934, but ill health prevented him from traveling to England. In 1926, he was elected as a member of the Punjab Legislative Council, now known as the Punjab Assembly, the Provincial Assembly, a position he retained until 1930, so he had practical experience of electoral democratic politics as well. He played an important role in determining the course of the All India Muslim League, which was to become India's largest Muslim political party. He also spoke for the need of a separate electoral system for Hindus and Muslims in India. In December 1930, at the annual meeting of the All India Muslim League held at Allahabad, he delivered the famous presidential address in which he proposed the creation of a separate Muslim homeland for at least the Muslims of Northwest India. In 1931, he represented the Muslims of India at a meeting of the World Islamic Congress held in Palestine. In 1931 and 1932, he again represented India's Muslims in the roundtable conferences in London, held to decide India's political future. In 1933, Iqbal traveled to Afghanistan at the invitation of Nadir Shah, who wished to consult him about Afghanistan's political system. Although he did not live to see the creation of Pakistan in 1947, he is revered as its spiritual father and its national poet. Iqbal died in Lahore at about dawn on the 21st of April 1938, some months shy of his 61st birthday. His funeral, which was led by the Imam of the historic Badshahi Mosque at Lahore, Maulana Ghulam Murshid, was attended by more than 50,000 people. He is buried beneath the high walls of the Badshahi Mosque, Lahore, in a simple mausoleum designed by Nawab Zain Yar Jung of Hyderabad, Deccan, the exterior of which is made of red sandstone imported from the city of Dholpur in India, and the white marble inside is gifted by Nadir Shah of Afghanistan. This brings to an end a discussion of the 4 phases of his life. We now look at his personality. In an autobiographical poem, Piety and Impiety, Zohad or Rindi, in Bange Dara, Iqbal tells of a neighbor, a religious scholar, who had heard that Iqbal, this is Iqbal's verse about a poem about his own self, but attributing it to a neighbor, a scholar, the scholar has heard that Iqbal, though well versed in Islamic law and religion, was not exactly a pious individual, that he recited the Quran at dawn but was also fond of music, which Islam forbids, that under the influence of his philosophical training, he refused to regard Hindus as infidels, that he was not averse to associating with beautiful women, and that he had Shiite leanings. On accosting the scholar in this poem one day, Iqbal confesses that he himself does not know the truth about himself, and that he wishes someday to see Iqbal. The translation is, even Iqbal does not know Iqbal, and this, by God, is no joke at all. Iqbal bhi Iqbal se आगाह नहीं है, कुछ इसमें तमस्खर नहीं, वल्लाह नहीं है. We see the humor in this, but undoubtedly an essential point is made that Iqbal is a multifaceted personality. He was a man of serious disposition by nature and training. While intellectually as well as emotionally he was devoted to the ideals of Islam, which his early training had inculcated in him, and his devotion only grew with time, he was by no means a religious obscurantist. Several writers have commented on his acceptance of broad humanity. His closest friends included not only Muslims but also Christians, Hindus and Sikhs. And in his poetry he sang the praises of several famous ancient and modern non-Muslims. When Iqbal lost his wife in 1935, and as an ailing man was left behind with a young son aged 11 years and a little daughter aged 5 years, he had no qualms about appointing a German woman of Christian faith as his children's governess. Ironically, when that governess, upon a visit to the missionary school in Lahore, which Iqbal's daughter was attending, came to know that Muslim children were being taught the Bible in one of the classes, protested against it, and pressed upon Iqbal to withdraw his daughter from that school, Iqbal overruled the governess, saying that his daughter should understand the basic principles of other religions, and directing that a Muslim teacher could be employed to teach the Quran to his daughter at home. Iqbal had an affective disposition. It grew out of his sensitive relation to both faith and aesthetics. He wept as he recited the Quran. Sometimes his copy of the Quran, wet with tears, had to be put out in the sun to dry. He was possessed with and admired courage of conviction, creativity, and a dervish mindset, embodied by self-sufficiency and indifference to the trappings of power, fame, and material things. Powerful verse moved him similarly. On one occasion, he was so overcome by emotion on reading a set of verses that he almost fainted. One of the high points of his emotional life was his visit to the Cordova Mosque in Spain. The visit took him, in his own words, to heights I had never experienced before. His poem Cordova Mosque is reckoned by many as his masterpiece. He was very attentive to detail and was in the habit of meticulously revising his work, which often resulted in delayed publication. And he often destroyed the poems that, in his view, did not meet a certain standard of excellence. But he was always quick to accept and appreciate well-founded criticism. He became a legend within his lifetime. He is fortunate enough, there is hardly any Urdu poet that I know of who gained recognition in his lifetime. They all got recognized after they had passed away, and most of them passed away in penury and poverty. But Iqbal was fortunate enough, his financial condition was not so great, but he was fortunate enough to, among those very few poets who gained recognition in his lifetime. He became a legend within his lifetime, and his stature has only grown since, in Pakistan at least. To cite a verse of Iqbal in support of one's view is practically to clinch the argument in one's favor. But that was not always the case. He has had his critics. He was attacked for accepting a knighthood, for writing poems to commemorate or celebrate certain occasions like the coronation of King George V or the death of Queen Victoria, for refusing to support the civil disobedience movement against British rulers, and for addressing God in a seemingly audacious manner in his poetry. But Iqbal also had his defenders, including some of the best known scholars and literary writers. And they have put up a fierce defense of Iqbal against the charges brought against him. Iqbal lived a simple, dignified, and principled life. His biographers have pointed out that during most of his life, especially in his last few years, when he was at the height of his fame, he lived in straitened circumstances, and that the British would have been only too happy to patronize him and give him financial support had he asked for it. But he never did. He was aptly called the poorest knight. Let me just walk you through his publications, the titles, because when you hear the titles and their translations, those by themselves tell you the level of his thinking or what he wished his message to be remembered as. He produced works in 3 languages. He wrote prose in English, poetry in Persian, and both poetry and prose in Urdu. He has a total of 15 publications to his credit, comprised of 7 collections of Persian poetry, 4 collections of Urdu poetry, 3 prose publications in English, and 1 prose publication in Urdu. His 7 Persian collections of poetry are called Asrar-e-Khudi, the secrets of the self, Ramuz-e-Bekhudi, the secrets of selflessness, Payam-e-Mashriq, the message of the East, Zabur-e-Ajam, Psalms of Persia, Javid-Nama, pilgrimage to eternity, Pas Chebaid Kard-e Aqwam-e-Sharq, what must now be done, O nations of the East, Armughan-e-Hijaz, the gift of the Hijaz, which is also written in Urdu. His 4 Urdu collections of poetry are called Bang-e-Darar, or the clarion call, Bar-e-Jibril, Gabriel's wing, Zarb-e-Kalim, the rod of Moses, Armughan-e-Hijaz in Urdu, which is the gift of the Hijaz. His 3 English publications are The Development of Metaphysics in Persia, which was his doctoral thesis, and I forgot to mention one little detail, that when it was first published in London, he dedicated it to Sir Thomas Arnold. The other publication is Stray Reflections, and the third, The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. And his solitary Urdu prose publication is called Ilmul Iqtisad, or Political Economy. Now, in the last part of my talk, I noticed that there are 6 to 7 minutes left. I will present to you his poetic art, his philosophical thought, and his political discourse. Iqbal's poetry has an extraordinary variety of themes. A randomly drawn list would include nature, the human situation, khudi or selfhood, life as a quest, and Islam as a living faith. Although Iqbal's poetry has variously dealt with nature, what stands out the most is how nature serves in it as a foil for drawing out man's potential. Nature is described as God's unfinished business, like a rough-hewn rock awaiting a sculptor's hand to chisel a masterpiece from it. Iqbal says human beings fulfill their proper role in the world in perfecting what is imperfect in nature, thereby also discharging their role as God's colleagues. In a short Persian poem in Payam-e-Mashriq, a dialogue between God and man, God accuses man of putting to evil use the benign natural objects. From the earth, I produced pure iron, but you made from that iron sword, arrow, and gun. In his response, man alludes to the enhancement of an otherwise crude and undeveloped nature. You made deserts, mountains, and valleys. I made gardens, meadows, and parks. I am one who makes a mirror out of stone and turns poison into sweet, delicious drink. In taking up human situation, Iqbal places in trust in the human being, a trust vindicated by the contribution that human beings have made in turning the world into a beautiful place. Yet again in Payam-e-Mashriq, Iqbal states, God created the world, but Adam made it better. Adam, perhaps, is God's co-worker. Iqbal also extensively and fascinatingly dwells on the idea that humans, though made of earth, are yet possessed of a certain element that impels them to break free of their earthly limitations and engage in a ceaseless search for loftier goals. In considering these loftier goals, it is pertinent to briefly examine Iqbal as the philosopher of khudi, or selfhood. Philosophically, Iqbal describes khudi as a primordial force, the ultimate reality or the absolute ego, whose personal name is God. This force, which we may call divine khudi, through self-assertion or self-manifestation, gives rise to a phenomenal world. Iqbal adds that khudi is a point of light and equates it to life itself. In Asrar Khudi, he says khudi is the spark of life in our dusty being. But the source of khudi's light is also divine. In his last publication, Armughan Hijaz, he says khudi is lit up from the light of the majestic one, and its very existence depends upon divine existence. Compared with the rest of creation, the human being possesses khudi in a relatively complete form, and for this reason tops the chain of created things. Iqbal gives detail of how khudi must be nurtured. He mentions factors that strengthen the khudi. For example, the love of God and the Prophet Muhammad, devotion to a noble cause, self-discipline and struggle against odds. And factors that weaken khudi, according to him, are dependence on others and life-negating philosophy and literature. At the start of the 20th century, the majority of the world's Muslims were politically weak, economically backward, and socially disintegrated. To Iqbal, this general decadence of the Muslims was due to the fact that they had forgotten who they were ashamed to take pride in their glorious tradition, suffered from a crisis of self-confidence, lacked self-esteem, and had despaired of building a bright future for themselves. In a word, they had allowed their khudi to waste away. The concept of khudi thus furnishes Iqbal with a reason for judgment, whether whatever nurtures khudi is good and whatever kills or dampens khudi is bad. The theme of khudi is closely linked in Iqbal's works with that of life as a quest and discovery. He asserts that the mandate of humans is to bring out their potential to the fullest and to change and mold the world after their heart's desire. This conquest of nature is an important way in which human beings affirm their khudi. To show that challenge strengthens khudi, Iqbal in Asrar Khudi, again, 100 years ago the publication came. Iqbal tells the story of the young man who visited the great Saint Ali Hajveri, also known as Data Ganj Bakhsh of Lahore, and complained to him that he was unable to fend off the many enemies that surrounded him. The saint, instead of commiserating with the young man, remarked that a powerful enemy is a blessing from God, since such an enemy presents man with challenges that push him to the limit, thereby bringing out the best in him. Since the human potential is limitless and the task of conquering nature never-ending, life becomes a series of quests, Iqbal notes in Payam-e-Mashriq. We must progress from one stage to another, never resting on our laurels, always regarding our destination as another milestone along the way. Success in life, Iqbal says in Asrar Khudi, requires strength, and one becomes strong not by passively conforming to the given scheme of things, but by putting the stamp of one's own personality on the resistant environment. The same substance, Iqbal says, becomes coal through his passive conformity to the environment, but it becomes a diamond, a shining diamond, when it seeks to assert itself by challenging the environment. Is that a hint?
No.
Trying to make his less.
He's trying to get the air conditioning on. That's
Please carry. Please carry.
Iqbal has used poetry to state and argue for a carefully formed and passionately held worldview. He writes in what may be called the High Urdu and High Persian, his poetry acquiring early on its distinctive quality, which is best described by the Arabic word jalal or the Persian word shiko, each of which signify majesty, stateliness, and grandeur. Iqbal's vocabulary is ultimately instrumental in character. He uses it to convey his understanding of life and reality. He holds particularly that existence is marked by perpetual change and movement. To begin with, the cosmos is in motion. The stars, the moon, and the sun are all traveling through space. But Iqbal does not simply note the fact of change and movement. He sees meaning in the fact. The heavenly bodies are in motion because they are earnestly pursuing a goal or seeking a destination. Noting a similar change and movement in human history, in human society, and in the individual human being, Iqbal sees correspondence between the condition of human beings and the condition of the heavenly bodies. He goes one step further, not content to situate the human being within the cosmos. He seeks to incorporate the cosmos within the human being. The human being is the primary fact. Adam created by God and meant to rule over the universe, all other existence enjoying only secondary status. It is the human being who manages and exploits the world and assigns value to it. In principle then, the human being towers above the universe. The story of the human being is thus becoming the story of a being with stature and importance next only to God's, a being whom Iqbal calls God's colleague or co-worker. To continue the motif of movement, Iqbal seems to be at his best when he is describing movement, whether physical or metaphorical. The following few lines describe the joyous movement of the mountain stream in Iqbal's grand poem Sakinama, or Ode to the Cupbearer, which itself celebrates movement, change, and creativity. In translation, it says, the mountain stream over there, it bounds, it halts, it curves, it glides, it leaps, it slides, it gathers itself. After much winding and turning, it sallies forth. Should it be stemmed, it would burst the rocks and cut open the hearts of the hills. This mountain stream, my fair cupbearer, has a message to give us of life. I'll tell you in Urdu what it reads like. वो जुए कोहिस्तां उचकती हुई, अटकती लचकती सिरकती हुई, उछलती फिचलती संभलती हुई, बड़े पेच खाकर निकलती हुई, रुके जब तो सिल चीर देती है ये, पहाड़ों के दिल चीर देती है ये. जरा देख ऐसा कि ये लाला फाम सुनाती है ये जिंदगी का पैगाम. Last but not least, I'll have to skip through the philosophical thought and the political discourse. I just noting that.
Carry on.
Yeah.
I think it'd be nice to hear you.
Okay, his political discourse, a little part of it is worthy of mention, I think, is that he argues that the essence of Tawheed, which is Islamic monotheism, the essence of Tawheed as a working idea is equality, solidarity, and freedom. The state, from an Islamic standpoint, is an endeavor to transform these ideal principles into a realization of definite human organization. Namely, again, equality, solidarity, and freedom. Fountainhead being Tawheed, the idea of oneness. In a short Urdu poem in Bange Dara, Iqbal refers to a nation as a body and the individuals comprising it to its limbs. Those in industry are the nation's hands and feet. Those who help to administer the government are its beautiful face. And those who cultivate arts, Iqbal mentions poets as representing this class, are its eyes. It follows that the failure of society's leaders or representatives can have disastrous consequences for the entire society. This understanding lies behind Iqbal's scathing criticism of the leaders of historical Muslim societies. Iqbal holds three factors. This is very important in his philosophy. He holds three factors especially responsible for the general decadence of the Muslim world in recent centuries. Number one, Mullaism. This is the name Iqbal gives to the hidebound attitude of the mullahs, the conventional ulama or religious scholars. Always a source of strength to Islam, Iqbal says. The ulama, during the course of centuries, especially since the destruction of Baghdad in 1258, became extremely conservative and would not allow any freedom or ijtihad, i.e. the forming of independent judgment in matters of law. So, it was Mullaism, number one. Number two, mysticism. In the history of Muslim societies, mysticism used to be, in the words of Iqbal, a force of spiritual education. In the later centuries, it disintegrated, cutting off Muslims from the actualities of life. Mystical practices increasingly became a mere means of exploiting the ignorance and gullibility of people. He adds that this created in Muslims the tendency to ignore the law, the only force holding Muslim society together. And this mysticism, according to Iqbal, replaced Muslim democracy with spiritual aristocracy. The third and last factor is kingship. Protection of their dynastic interests, whatever form they may take, being their first priority. Muslim kings did not hesitate to sell their countries to the highest bidders. Iqbal's criticism of mullaism, mysticism, and kingship as the main factors responsible for the decadence of Muslim societies is not a blanket criticism of Muslim legists, mystics, and rulers. Iqbal held that in early Islamic history, the three institutions of law, mysticism, and politics embodied, for varying lengths of time, the dynamic Islamic spirit. In later periods, however, the legists became prisoners of formalism. The mystics were seduced by a false dichotomy of spirit and matter, and the rulers sacrificed collective interest at the altar of personal gain. The fact that the same institutions can be at one time forces of progress and at another time forces of decadence suggests that they need to and can be reformed. Therefore, instead of calling for a wholesale rejection of tradition, Iqbal aims at reinvigorating it by subjecting it to critical scrutiny with a view to retaining its kernel and discarding its husk. Iqbal emphasized that the existence of competent leaders is crucial to a society's viability and progress, but so is the well-being, especially the economic well-being of the masses. It is the masses, I quote from him, "It is the masses," he said in a letter. "It is the masses who are the backbone of the nation. They ought to be better fed, better housed, and properly educated," adding that Muslim social organizations should realize that their main obligation is to elevate the masses, not to exalt individuals. As an elected member of the Punjab Legislative Council, Iqbal often spoke on land revenue and taxation, demanding greater justice in land assessment and even land revenue exemption in hardship cases. In a speech made on the floor of the House in March 1927, he pleaded the case for compulsory primary education, which only in 2010 became a fundamental right under Pakistan's constitution. He pleaded the case for compulsory primary education, and in a speech a couple of months later, he advocated for better sanitation in villages and for medical aid to India's women. He additionally emphasized the importance of technical education as a means of achieving general economic prosperity. He was also admittedly a social democrat, as stated in a letter to Muhammad Ali Jinnah just a year before his death in May 1937. He says to Mr. Jinnah, "For Islam, the acceptance of social democracy in some suitable form and consistent with the legal principles of Islam is not a revolution. Acceptance of social democracy in Islam is not a revolution. It is a return to the original purity of Islam," Iqbal writes to Jinnah. "The modern problems, therefore, are far from easy," he continues in that same letter, "far more easy to solve for the Muslims than for the Hindus. But as I have said, in order to make it possible for Muslim India to solve the problems, it is necessary to redistribute the country and to provide one or more Muslim states with absolute majorities. Don't you think, Mr. Jinnah, that the time for such a demand has already arrived? Perhaps this is the best reply you can give to the aesthetic socialism of Jawaharlal Nehru." Iqbal is often called a pan-Islamist, but this can be misleading. Iqbal wished to unify the Muslims of the world, but their unification, in his view, would have a spiritual rather than a geographical basis. He nowhere proposes that the existing Muslim countries should abolish their borders and create a universal Muslim state ruled by a single caliph. He grants the possibility of the simultaneous existence of many Muslim states and many Muslim rulers. It is well known that for a period of time, Iqbal was a proponent of Indian nationalism, but political developments in the country led him to remark that India's most difficult problem is the communal problem, namely the problem of the conflict-ridden relationship between Hindus and Muslims. Eventually, he was convinced that the essential disparity between the two cultural units of India would not permit the hoped-for coexistence. Hence the historical address in 1930 in Allahabad, in which he proposed the creation of a state for the Muslims of India. Besides that, Iqbal also took practical steps to unite Indian Muslims under one political banner. In the first place, he strove to make the All India Muslim League the representative political party of the country's Muslims. Secondly, he was instrumental in persuading Muhammad Ali Jinnah to again become active in practical politics and provide much needed leadership to India's Muslims. in emphasizing the preservation of Muslim cultural identity as the first priority of India's Muslims. He also advises the All India Muslim League, in order to be successful, ought to rely on Muslim masses rather than on elite Muslim groups. I close by quoting from some excerpt from the biographer Mustansir Mir, from what he refers to as Iqbal's legacy, and I quote from now until the end. It is generally granted that Iqbal is both one of the most significant and one of the most influential Muslim writers and thinkers of modern times. Iqbal's greatness consists in interpreting the spirit of Islamic culture in a way that shows Islam to be a dynamic, forward-looking, and all-encompassing movement that not only has profound meaning for those who believe in the religion, but also promises to serve as a force for good in the world at large. In the history of modern thought, when that history deigns to recognize the merit of the works of non-Western thinkers, Iqbal will be remembered as one who mounted a spirited defense of the possibility of religion in a so-called scientific age. But perhaps Iqbal's most enduring legacy consists of his zestful affirmation of life. A study of Iqbal's life reveals that he was interested in practically everything that life had to offer. He read much, he dreamed much, and he hoped much. He corresponded with many people, as he had made close friendships with many people from many different communities and nationalities. And above all, he was open to new ideas. His readers find his works to be inspiring. No less inspiring to them is his decidedly positive attitude to life. I thank you.